Welcome back, guys. Today I want to talk about whether or not a half-ton truck is actually cheaper to drive than a three-quarter-ton truck. And we're going to use my '05 Silverado here as an example. We're going to kind of combine what this is with a modern half-ton. I'll get into that later. And then we'll use my Ford F250 as an example of a 2500, and we'll all talk about an older 2500 as well, and then that newer one, which is a 2022, that you'll see later in the video. So what I want to touch on here, when you talk about cost of driving, right, there's a couple of factors. Number one, there's the original purchase price, of course. Number two, there's all of your running costs, your fuel, your brakes, your tires, etc., etc. And then there's the, I'm going to call it the cost of inconvenience, right? So physical size, width, length, parking ability, all that kind of thing. Let's start off with the actual fuel costs, okay? So a lot of modern trucks, and actually this truck, believe it or not, which has a 6-liter LQ9 that I swapped into it, recommend premium fuel. Now, I know what you're thinking. Probably everyone you know does not run premium fuel in their half-ton truck. They just go to the gas station and dump 87 octane in it. Well, if you look at the owner's manual for most modern vehicles that have the premium engine, so like a 3.5 EcoBoost, a 6.2 Chevy V8, or a Ram 5.7, and I'm sure the Hurricane, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure the Hurricane, they all say in the manual, 87 acceptable, 91 or higher recommended. That's typically the nomenclature they use. So what that's telling you is, yes, you can get away with 87, but you're not going to get the maximum performance via power and fuel economy. Now, typically, 87 octane will still be cheaper on a per mile basis, because even though you lose some fuel economy, you actually, the fuel is so much cheaper that you don't lose money in the process. Even if you lose a little bit of economy, you'll just lose some range. That being said, if you're trying to tow heavy with your half ton, you probably want to run the premium fuel, A, to get the power, and B, just because then you're not risking the engine getting hot and then starting to ping a little bit potentially. Modern fuel injection systems do a pretty good job of limiting that, but you just never know, right? So even though a lot of people probably don't do it, on a really hot day, towing a heavy trailer, you probably should. And when you do the math on that, which I will put on the screen here, you will find example A with a half ton running premium and example B of my 3/4 ton running 87. All of a sudden, you find that the numbers are actually in favor of the 3/4 ton. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is your tires, okay? One big advantage of a half-ton truck, cost-wise, is they run a passenger car rated tire. So these are not a LT truck tire, right? The stock tires are just a regular 265, 65, 18. If you look at an F250 or any 2500, 3500, they're gonna have an LT and then the size of the tire. That means the tire is much heavier duty, it's thicker, it rides a little harsher and stuff, but it can carry a lot more weight. With that, though, comes a higher initial purchase price. If you look at the cost of the same size tire in a passenger car tire and the same size tire in a LT, you can see the LT is more expensive. Now, the LT does give you more tread depth, typically. Okay, so if you have more tread depth, presumably it will last a little longer, so you can get some of that cost back on a per mile basis. So that helps. However, I will throw another caveat in there. If you're towing kind of heavy with your half ton, I tend to recommend bumping up to an LT tire on a half ton. Not because you need to necessarily load capacity wise, depending on the tire. The load rating on these tires, I don't even know what it is. I don't tow with this truck anymore, so I don't really care, to be completely honest. But the load rating is generally pretty close to the maximum rear axle capacity in most cases. So if your rear axle is, say, rated for 4,000 pounds total, generally the tires might be like 4,100 pounds or 4,200 pounds in a lot of cases. So with that being said, you do run the, I don't want to say risk, but you are running the tires up pretty close to their rated capacity. Now, they're rated for it, so you're not doing anything wrong, but it's just something to consider. Generally, on a 2 or 350, as long as you get the right tires, you usually have a pretty good buffer there, even if you have that truck maxed out. So that's just something to consider there. Tire cost may not be so much different if you are running an LT tire on your half ton especially, and even if you're not running an LT and you're really loading these things up to their max capacity, you might find they also wear out kind of fast. I can tell you right now, these tires will not last as long mileage wise as the LTs that I used to have in this truck did, just because they started off with less tread and they're just not as heavy duty, right? So the cost is not necessarily way different. The next thing is your brakes. This is one that there really is no case to be made. You would think a half-ton truck has smaller brakes, they're cheaper to buy the rotors and the pads for, and therefore it's going to be cheaper to, do the same activity with a half-ton as you would a 3/4 ton. Well, let me stop you there again. So most half-ton trucks, old or new, I have found tend to go through brakes, again, if you're towing, in say 30 to 40,000 miles. It just seems to be about how long you'll get out of a set of brakes. Now, some of the real modern stuff, modern half tons, have pretty big brakes and they'll actually last quite a long time. However, my F250, as I'll show you in the video, has giant brakes on it and they seem to last an incredibly long time. I have 60,000 miles on the truck, and those brake pads are not even at half life. Like, it's incredible. They're on pace to literally last 100,000 miles. So although they are more expensive than these brakes, on a cost per mile basis, once again, by just having not had to replace them versus you'll have replaced these once in that time, your cost per mile is actually still cheaper with the brakes. The next thing is just the wear and tear on the vehicle and all the little odds and ends you might have to replace. So if you take any half-ton truck, now this is an extreme example because it's an older half-ton and all of its components are less heavy duty than a modern half-ton. However, if we look, you can see the rear axle is very small, the drive shaft is pretty thin, it's aluminum, the U-joints are small, the transmission obviously is smaller, and then keep in mind, this is an aftermarket Kurt trailer hitch, which is actually much heavier duty than the stock GMT 800 hitches. They're kind of known to be a little bit weak, but even despite that, it's plenty strong enough for this truck. But just look at how much smaller the hitch is. Again, not rated to tow nearly as much, but it's just a lot less material. So just these are the types of things to think about. Everything is just simply less heavy duty. Drivetrain wise, look at the size of that rear axle in comparison. Much heavier duty. Look at the support ribs on there, the size of the tubes, just way heavier duty. Still an aluminum drive shaft. Actually has a similar diameter, but if you'll notice, the U-joints are way bigger. And if you give it the old, knock test, you can tell that the wall thickness is much thicker. So yeah, it's kind of a similar diameter, but you do get a little bit of strength from that. And then if we go all the way forward, big transfer case, bigger transmission. Obviously the frame is a taller cross section and it's fully boxed. The Silverado is C-channel and a shorter cross section, and the tail section of the frame is a little bit thinner, but the part under the cab is, huge. So, just a totally different thing. And as a result, for a given weight trailer, say 8,000 pounds, whatever it is, you are just taxing the smaller components more than you would on a truck with heavier duty components. That's just the way that it is, right? Those heavier duty components are rated to tow, say 15,000 pounds. These are only rated to tow, say 8,000 pounds. So you're pushing them to their max, whereas with a 3/4 ton, you're pushing them essentially half in that example to what they're capable of doing. And as a result, you can probably expect much longer life out of them. And like the brakes, if you're going to get longer life out of the heavier duty component, you just wind up with a cheaper cost per mile as a result, and less downtime and less annoyance of having to repair things, which is just convenience, a huge amount of convenience. Along those lines, right, that goes for everything else in the truck, the front end steering components, the rear suspension, right? Obviously the leaves on this are much thinner and smaller, and there's less of them than there would be on a 3/4 ton, or they're at least thicker on a 3/4 ton or a 1 ton. You don't have the overload leaf, so you'll run into other disadvantages like stability and stuff, but we're just talking about cost. So that's kind of another reason why you might want to get the heavier duty truck. This next one is kind of a bit of a hidden cost for a lot of people. But if you're towing a camper, what winds up happening is basically every half ton, unless you get a max tow truck, has a regular mirror like this on it. It's pretty rare that you'll find a half ton from the factory comes with a towing mirror. And so you kind of, if you want to do it right, in my opinion, you have to buy yourself some sort of towing mirror. Now, they make the slide-on mirrors that are 20, 30, 40 bucks, and they work fine, so they're cheap enough. But it is one more thing you got to pack and remember to have, and then you got to install and take off when you get where you're going, which is a mild annoyance, and it's an additional cost, albeit small. Or you've got to convert these to an actual towing mirror, and then that's $600, $700, $800. If you get like a real nice one, you can cheap out. But sometimes the cheap mirrors, they'll vibrate when you're driving, so that's not always the best idea. So even something like the mirror itself, which is just a little component you wouldn't think much of, can kind of add up a little bit and become a bit of a cost penalty on you. Next, something to consider. So now we got to kind of use a new truck as an example. But if we take a modern half-ton F-150 and my modern F-250, let's just do two 2025 models to be perfectly fair. If you trim it out to like an XLT crew cab 6.5 foot bed, EcoBoost versus like my Godzilla 7.3, those are pretty comparable trucks in a lot of ways. They're the same length, give or take. They're obviously the same cab configuration, same bed configuration, all that sort of thing. But if you look at the MSRP, as you can see on the screen, they cost about the same amount of money. So your initial entry price isn't really any different. Another thing we need to look into is depreciation. Sometimes there are discounts off MSRP on half tons that you don't get on a 3/4 ton, but in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years even, that really hasn't been the case for the most part. That MSRP is basically what you're paying, unfortunately. But as you'll see, the F-150s are kind of on the average. They just lose more value for a given mileage. And that is something that you really want to consider, because if you're not somebody who's going to keep the thing until the wheels fall off, maybe you're going to keep it to 100 or 150,000 miles, something like that. That residual value is super important in order to get your money back out of it on the other side. So that can be an extremely costly cost per ownership item. If it depreciates an extra $5,000 and you factor in all of the other things in this video, well, all of a sudden you might have spent a considerable more amount of money on that half ton despite thinking it would have been cheaper. So anyway, kind of sort of wrapping this all up, right? A lot of this is going to come down to this simple fact. The big caveat of all this is, are you actually using the truck as a truck, right? Are you consistently towing and hauling often? Call it 50% of the truck's miles that you put on it, or maybe even like 30, 40% of the miles you put on it. If the answer is yes, yeah, you're going to get worse fuel economy empty commuting. But I think the cost of the extra wear and tear and the fuel and the brakes and the tires on the half ton may in fact wind up costing you more in the long run than just buying the 3/4 ton truck, accepting the fact that commuting you're not getting as much as good fuel economy, and just dealing with that fact, right? Even though most people wouldn't think that, most people, myself included, always shied away from a 3/4 ton because you'd never wanted to take that fuel economy hit, and you're like, oh, I only tow X amount of time, I'm going to be wasting my money. Again, maybe not. Maybe you're actually not wasting your money and you're actually saving money in the long run, even though it does seem hard to believe sometimes. There is no right answer, right? But I do think a lot of people may not make the right choice when they buy a half ton, thinking they're doing themselves a favor, and they're actually not. So if you take anything away from this video, I would say just do a little bit of math, evaluate how much you actually tow, how much you actually haul, how much weight the towing and hauling is, how often it is. And then you got to just determine what size truck makes the most sense for you. I think you'll find that the numbers sway in the favor of a 3/4 ton more often than you might think. So that's just kind of my thought on it. As always, guys, let me know in the comments what you think. If you think I'm wrong, if you think my numbers are bad, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. God bless America, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.